Hey, discerning listeners, 90 Day Fiancé, The Single Life. Let's watch.
Yeah, sure.
I haven't seen my mother for a month because my wife and I, Vanessa, have been living with her cousin. I'm back at the house now because I didn't get a chance to pack anything before I left. My mother and I have this weird codependency. Ever since my father died, I was the surrogate son / best friend / husband.
It's a surrogate husband. I don't know if he's explicitly said that before. So the primary method of control in an enmeshed surrogate partner type of relationship is through guilt. So the parents often will guilt trip the children, say, oh, you're killing me, or you're a bad kid. It's usually those methods to get the child in line with what they need the child to be like.
I haven't seen my mother for a month because my wife and I, Vanessa, have been living with her cousin. I'm back at the house now because I didn't get a chance to pack anything before I left.
All right, interesting. So we're learning that he suddenly moved out and didn't have a chance to pack anything up, and that they're living with Vanessa's cousin. So it sounds like maybe for free, and that's their only option at this point.
My mother and I have this weird codependency. Ever since my father died, I was the surrogate son / best friend / husband.
Right, so he's using the word codependency, which is the layperson's usage, which is not the correct clinical usage. Although I will see on websites where they claim to know things, what they are doing is they are mixing two concepts that we have in our clinical field. One is dependent personality and possibly dependent personality disorder, and codependency. So these are very different. Talked about this before, but briefly. So when people are using codependent, they're usually meaning dependent. So when we talk about someone being overly dependent on another person, overly enmeshed at the expense of other relationships, too needy of a particular person, and maybe even both directions, that is overly dependent or dependent personality disorder, or on that spectrum somewhere, where the person, abnormally or dysfunctionally depends on another person in a way that is excessive, and a way that is oppressive to other people, and in a way that actually harms them in the end because they don't believe they can do things on their own. There's no flexibility there, that kind of thing. So often dependent individuals will have one person that they're super dependent on. Sometimes it's different, but that's often how things land. And so for her, she was overly dependent on him. And she believed that she couldn't do things on her own. She couldn't live on her own. She couldn't pay her bills. She couldn't have relationships outside of him. She needed him for emotional support, for everything. And he might have also. In the very beginning, when we first met them, she made all of his food. But it's unclear if she was imposing that dependency on him or if he actually wanted that. Who knows? But often people will characterize that as codependency because they think they're seeing two dependent people and they're codependent, meaning that they're both dependent. But that's not the definition of codependency. Codependency is different than dependency. In some ways, it's the direct opposite, but not exactly. In that when people are codependent, they have, and this is my way of framing it, and there are different ways of framing it, but it is someone who needs to take care of someone with a problem, that in a nutshell. So the word comes from the chemical dependency world, where you would have someone, in the distant past, in the world of drug and alcohol treatment, they would call people alcoholics, right? Then eventually they started to include other substances, so they started saying chemically dependent. And then eventually they just called the person with the substance abuse problem the dependent person. So that person is dependent on a substance. And then often what they would find is that there was a codependent, a co-pilot in the dependency upon the substance. And so the codependent is a person in relationship with the dependent, the chemically dependent person. In fact, the first term I think was co-chemical dependent or something as a way of really emphasizing, but eventually they just called it codependent. And the behaviors of this person are really quite varied, but generally speaking, when we're talking about codependency today in the clinical literature, we're talking about someone that defines themselves when they are taking care of someone else with a problem. Their whole self-worth is based on that action. And when there isn't that action of taking care of someone with a problem, they're aimless. They don't know who they are. They fall apart. And so to some extent, they will subconsciously enable or encourage or shame the dependent person to continue using. It's complicated, but that's what codependency is. So what he's describing, I would describe it as enmeshment. I would describe it as a reaction to the father dying and the mother's issues that probably predate the death of her husband. And the mother the mother, for whatever reason, thought the only way she was going to get her needs met was through Colt. Pushed aside her better thinking, because I'm sure that there was a voice inside of her that's saying, you're being too pressuring, or you need to let him grow up. I'm sure that emerged in her, but she pushed that aside because she was so desperate to just get some of her needs met. And one thing led to another, and she socializes her son into being her husband.
I mean, I haven't talked to you, so I don't know really anything, honestly.
A lot of stuff going on. I think I texted you Happy Thanksgiving and you did not respond.
I'm still...
What?
I don't know. I don't know really. I feel like there's just so much tension between us.
Gee, let's see. Why is there tension between us?
Yikes. So, sarcasm. There's tension because of you. Now, what she's going to say is, because you kicked me out, which they never did. I mean, just think about what they had to resort to. They were giving her all this time. And remember, she's had at least a decade to prepare for the common reality that her son will not want to live with her anymore. But if we just think about the time that we've seen them, that's been a number of years, I think, where she's at least had time to think about it. Then he gives her 3 months, and presumably there were signals earlier than that, right? Because he was with Vanessa, so she should have intuited at some point, I'm going to have to move out. So they give her 3 months, and I think they gave her an extension on that because they had a fight, and then they find an apartment for her. She refuses to take it. She doesn't move out, and then he has to move out of a house that he's paying the bills for, I think. I don't know, but he has a job, and so I don't know what her situation is, but he had to move out of his house and leave her in a giant home, and he's living with Vanessa's cousin. They're couch surfing essentially because she will not move out. Just think about that, how enraged you would be as if you're Colt in that situation. It would just be maddening, right? So then he's like, oh, there's just so much tension. And she's like, gee, I wonder why there's so much tension. Let's see what she says here.
I understand that you and Vanessa have a life, and I don't want to interfere with it, but I can't live here and pay all the finances. Vanessa moved out, and then you moved out. We have a lease. We signed it. We all knew. So how do you not see what you did to me?
Yeah, it's a guilt trip. That's what I was saying. The method is guilt. Now, it's often not conscious as a manipulation. It feels that way to her. She has a mindset, a viewpoint. Why would you abandon me? She uses those words, you betrayed me. It feels that way to her based on something going on for her. And it's not like she wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to manipulate my son and guilt trip him. It feels appropriate to guilt trip in this way, but from the outside, it's awful. And just imagine what was going on all these years, because we're just seeing what is happening to be presented on camera. I mean, I think that's why for so often Colt would just be silent. And then when he would say something, it would just be explosive. And then he would feel bad, and then they'd go back to the same homeostasis. But again, it's just a shame that they are in this situation, and she is engineering a future where he basically has to completely cut her off because of the guilt tripping and the manipulation. It's tragic, really, because if they just had a family therapist to help guide, I've worked with Enmeshment a lot, and there's a lot of, it's not hard to work on, is the point. It's like one of the first things you cover when you're studying systems and family therapy is enmeshment. So it's a pretty easy thing to cover. And now it can take a long time to change because her relational traumas might be extensive as to why she's engaging in that mindset and that reactivity, but the knowledge of it, the assessment of it, and the self-awareness of it doesn't take very long.
How do you see what you've done to me? You've treated me very poorly. I don't know why. I've always asked you, why do you treat me like a child? I'll always be your son, but I'm definitely not a small child anymore. So there has to be some kind of respect and distance.
You know, this.
So he's right, and from our standpoint, we know what he's talking about, but I don't think she knows what he's talking about. Like, if I were there, I would say, okay, so Debbie, imagine a future where Colt and you do not live together, and your finances are separate, because that's, just imagine that hypothetically. You are either getting Social Security or you have savings. I don't know. There's just, or something along those lines. Or maybe if you can't afford bills, maybe you're getting assistance. You know, it's, if that's where you're at, then that's where you're at. Anyway, so your finances are separate. You don't live together. And let's say you text once a day-ish. You talk on the phone once a week. You see each other every 2 weeks or something for dinner or a picnic or something. Maybe a little less, who knows, but that kind of life. How does that feel to you? Because intellectually, I think she would know, well, that's normal, right? To have an adult son that you don't see all the time, but you have some contact with. And yeah, it makes sense that adults have separate finances at this phase. So, okay, but internally, she would really be struggling with it, in my guess. And this is usually where we can differentiate between what they know should be happening and what they feel should be happening, and differentiating those two things. And then I would say, okay, what's happening for you? As you imagine that, what feelings do you have? Because I'm guessing what happens is betrayal, is loneliness, is demoralization, those kind of feelings. And then I would say, okay, so let's really look at those feelings. Those feelings are okay. Let's not transform them down the flowchart into anger and hostility and control and guilt tripping. Let's just sit with those feelings of loneliness and demoralization and feeling worthless. I don't wish that you had those feelings, but they're there, okay? So what's going on with you there? And then she would probably start to cascade towards, well, if he treated, no, we're going to solutions, we're going to thoughts based on the feelings. Just stick with the feelings. What does that feel like for you? What does that feel? Because if she were to pause there with the feelings, then we would have some basis for understanding, for validation. He could validate her, I could validate, she could actually take care of herself. Because probably what's happening, and this is true for a lot of people, regardless of what's happening for you, is something will happen in your life and you'll descend into some negative feeling, and then you quickly bounce away from it because you don't want to acknowledge it, or you're afraid of it, or you don't really know what's happening, and you go right to a quote-unquote solution, like guilt tripping and making him into a pseudo-husband, that kind of thing, instead of just sitting with the emotion. Okay, I'm lonely, I'm sad, I feel like I'm never going to find anyone, I feel like no one will ever love me, I feel like the universe took my husband away. I feel like it's happening again. You know, it feels that way to me. It feels unfair. That's a whole other thing. I think I remember hypothesizing that having her husband die, she might have some unresolved grief that it's just unfair that he died. It doesn't make sense, right? Because it's not like the universe is punishing her or something. It just happened, right? And she could be displacing that onto him as a feeling of like, it's happening again. Someone's leaving me. It's unfair. This is unfair, you know? And I don't know, it's just a shot in the dark, total speculation. But so we would want her to sit with that feeling. Now, it could take many sessions, perhaps years, honestly. I've done this before. With Debbie, I could see it taking a while, honestly. But if I could get her on board and I really cared for, and Colt also cared for those feelings, then honestly, that might be all that's needed to have that closeness, to have that compassion, to have that security in me and in Colt of just that her feelings are okay, that they're justified, she's not weird, and then she can just stop there. She doesn't have to bounce away to a solution like guilt tripping and control and all these other things. So that's what I would be doing. But anyway, so he's saying something that's really quite rational. I think a lot of people would agree. And now, because she is trying to avoid the feeling, and she doesn't know the feeling or something, she's going to a solution, which I think she's going to try to attack. It's probably a really old mechanism that she has been doing for years and years and years, but I think Colt will detect it and will defend himself. But I don't know. I mean, maybe he'll move back in. All right. Well, that does it for that episode. Tune in next time when I see what else comes out of my face as I watch this show. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.